To welcome everyone here to our Gippsland Supporting Clients to Age Well forum. I would like to open today's forum by just acknowledging the traditional owners on the land on where we're meeting. Most of us here are meeting on Gallagher land, and I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I'd also like to pay my respects to any Aboriginal people here today. We're very lucky today to have two fantastic speakers. Our first speaker today is going to be Gerard Mansour, who's the Commissioner for Senior Victorians. And our second presentation will be given by Jill Gallagher, the CEO of VACCHO. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Delighted to join you all on a wonderful afternoon where I am. I'd like to start also by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands we're on today, and I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people here, and the sun's shining beautifully through my window. I've been able to look at it. I did hear something funny today where somebody said the closest I've got to today's sunshine is looking at the sun coming through your window on the other side of the screen I'm looking at. So yeah, I've been lucky. I spent a few minutes out in the sun. So look, thanks very much, Richard, for the invitation, and always a great pleasure to have an opportunity to share the stage with Jill. And Jill, acknowledge your amazing leadership, not only for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in general, but the commitment and passion you've got for elders and older Aboriginal people. And yeah, so it's a delight to be with you again today. Today I'd like to share with you some information that I've gained from my report, Aging Well in a Changing World. And some of you may have heard some of this presentation before, but I hope I can give you some additional insights. Today, I'm going to take you through each of the key learnings that I had from my report as a snapshot. Very happy to make this presentation available to you. I've prepared it as a bit of a resource, so I'm not going to cover everything in the presentation today, but I will go through and touch on each of the attributes in some way and how it relates, I think, to the current environment. So I'm going to try to make some connections with what I'll finish with is some observations about where older people are now in the light of COVID and moving back more into community life in general terms. Obviously, for regional areas, you're ahead of us on this journey. So when we get to the chat, Richard, I'd be very keen to hear your observations about where people are at, because a lot of my more recent experience has obviously been around the metropolitan area. So a bit about my role, for those that maybe haven't connected with me in the past. It really came out of a parliamentary inquiry back in 2012, where a number of older people who made submissions to the parliamentary inquiry made the observation that as they get older, they're not sure that government really hears them in the same way that they did in other parts of their life. And as I learned through this more recent consultation, often it's about a sense that as people get older, they become a bit invisible to key policymakers and key deciders within government and government departments. So really the key role I have is to give a voice to older people. I tend to do that in two main ways. One is to respond to opportunities that different areas of government bring to me. For example, recently I was asked to do a submission to the parliamentary inquiry about the multi-purpose taxi program. How disability access discounts are really important from a travel point of view. So that's an example. Recently, I've also done a submission about the changes that are proposed to the Retirement Villages Act. So part of my role is a responsive role to changes that are occurring across government to make sure that whenever those policy considerations are occurring, that older people are part of that consideration. The other part of my work is the proactive work, where in my regular meetings with the relevant ministers, I set areas where I would be proactively focusing. And two of the more recent ones are the areas of isolation and loneliness of older people. I did a report back in 2016 on that, and much more recently at the end of last year, my report on aging well in a changing world. And an important part of my work as a result of the Family Violence Royal Commission is a role I play as an ambassador for elder abuse prevention. And again, in all the range of family violence reforms, making sure that the fairly unique ways that elder abuse applies, which can be both similar and different to other experiences of family violence, that they can be taken into account. And in that area, again, acknowledge the work that Jill and others are doing from an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspective. Some of the videos that were launched just recently that give an example of how often we've got to take high-level messages about family violence and then translate those not only to an older person's perspective, but particular cohorts. And so that was fantastic to see that recent leadership and work that occurred. And so on to my recent report. So the whole purpose of my activity was to, by engaging actively with older people themselves, that I would get a picture of how they see the attributes of ageing well. And so that's what I'm going to share with you. It's not an academic piece of work. It drew on, in design of our survey phase of consultation, it drew on a lot of the national and international research that we've got, but it's really dominant purpose in my meetings and conversations with older people. And I engage with people from 27 different local government areas across Victoria to give me as broad a representation as possible. I would have loved to have talked to more people, but that's the constraint of any role like mine. We've always got to cut our cloth a bit. But I must say, by the end of the consultation, I was confident that these high-level 8 attributes do actually give us a fairly clear insight into how the majority of people see the ageing journey. I hasten to add that it will always vary a bit depending on who we're talking to. So some cohorts of people would have a different accent on some of these. And some people might say, well, look, we think there's something really important to us that's not quite captured in this. And I totally acknowledge that. So my objective was to come up with a majority view of how we could see the key attributes of ageing well, but through the lens of older people and their voices. And so if you have a look at my report and the way I structured my report, I tried to embed each of the attributes with quotes from older people during the consultation that give some clarity about what their voices were and what their attributes are. And for those of you that are maybe interested in the more detailed analysis, if you have a look at my report on page 20, there's actually a one-page table that gives all the elements that sit within each of these 8 attributes. And so today I can't really do much more than to give you a quick snapshot about what each of the attributes is. They're not in priority order, so it's not 1 to 8, but I have front-loaded the first 2 as 2 of the most important ones, because the community and the audience that I have for this is policymakers, older people themselves, people that are at the front line of providing support. So they're the sort of audiences I was thinking about. When we talk about ageing well, people don't necessarily think about these 2 core issues about attitudes that older people themselves hold. And the first one is having a positive attitude. And here's a quote, an example. You need to have a positive attitude to age well, but you need to have acceptance that you'll need help one day. And this is a really important part of the conversation that occurred, that on the one hand, we want to continue to innovate and inspire and be open to new things. And just because we're getting older doesn't mean that there are a whole lot of different things that could come and motivate us. For me, as an example, I can remember a few years ago, before COVID, when we could sit down in Melbourne and have a cup of coffee in the Vic Market, which I was at. And I was thinking about this, I'd recently turned 60 and I was reflecting on, I wonder what my journey of aging might look like. And I looked up, and on the back of someone's t-shirt was a little slogan that I've tried to own as my own slogan. And it was a slogan that said, never stop exploring. And I thought, that's something that I want to do as I get older. I don't want myself to be regarded as like a stale old fuddy-duddy. But I think for each of us, the journey of aging brings an attitude. And what is it for us and for the people that we support? And so, the positive attitude was a really important one. But why did people talk about the other side of the equation? And you'll see in the risks there a really powerful comment. And actually this one I can remember came from the consultation I had at ACES, one of the metropolitan organisations that supports Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And they said, sometimes we're so proud and can't ask for help. Some things could be avoided if people asked earlier. And this is a really important part of the journey. For some of us, we do understand that reaching out for support is a positive thing for us. But for others, it can be a real challenge. Sometimes the visibility, for example, of having a hearing aid to assist us, or the visibility of using a walker frame, can in our own minds have a stigma attached where we're not open to that side of support and assistance. And so the attitude that we ourselves carry, of course, is so important. The next part of it, and this was a really important part of the journey for really everybody that talked with me, is what's the meaning and purpose that we've got in life? And here's one example of that. Someone shared, enjoy life, get involved in the community, socialise with other people, join groups, get out, and back then even travel was something that we talked about. For others, it was volunteering. For others, it was, I can remember, connections to country. There are so many different things that give people meaning and purpose in life. But one of the constants that I heard through the consultations is the fact that as we get older, often these change. Some people, lots of people, are really good and just adapt and find something else. And it's just a journey as they shift from one motivator to another. It might be different groups that they join. It might be different activities, moving into, say, an interest in art and crafts for the first time. But for other people, this was a real clash and a real challenge. And they found it difficult that leaving a role, say, I can remember some people talking about the role of moving out of the paid workforce into a part-time or a retirement role, and how that actually changed the nature of their identity and what motivated them. They hadn't found that next step yet. They hadn't found what it was that was going to inspire them. And so it really stuck in my mind. Some people will innovate and shift and find this without even thinking. For others, this is a real central part of their identity and thinking about what gives meaning and purpose. One of the constants is so many people talk to me about how this can change over time. And one of the challenges, as you can see, is that, say, moving towards retirement, there's an increasing trend for people to think about financial planning, to think about what they might do in the first 6 or 12 months. But not many people would think about planning for changes in meaning and purpose. What is it that's going to give us fulfillment? And so I think that for a lot of us, the challenge is, what are those meaningful roles that are going to inspire us as we age? Another really important part of the whole attributes is the sense of respect and being valued. And this was really closely tied to conversation and language about diversity and culture and identity. That people want to, as they get older, want to be seen for who they are just at any other point of time in their life. And central to that was respect. And one of the really interesting quotes that came up, and it came up in different language nearly in every setting, is they don't want to be treated like an old person. That life stage doesn't and shouldn't define who we are. They wanted to be valued and respected as a valued, insightful member of the community. But the very interesting thing, as the conversations occurred, it was very much a sense that this is a two-sided coin. It's about expecting respect, but it's also about giving respect, to be tolerant of others, to respect other cultures. But it's also a narrative, and this is a word people didn't use often themselves, and the word being ageism. But they gave so many examples of stereotypes, of stigma, that people felt they were denied access or support just because they were older. And so as a commissioner, I've got an increasing focus on how we can name and address this issue of ageism. It was sometimes presented in language about feeling invisible, and at other times it was presented as a language or a portrayal of people that they rejected or objected to. I saw that just recently. There was one of our former prime ministers that was making a comment about China. And there were people that didn't agree with his interpretation, and that's fine. But I was really interested that some of the commentators then moved to naming. And I can remember one of the reporters named him as an old fossil. And there's an example of the sort of language that people are pushing back on, and they don't want to be defined in that sort of way. If people object, argue the point, don't name or blame us in a way. So the risks and challenges they identified is there is a stigma that many people do feel. There is an invisibility that we do want to name, and that respect, giving and receiving respect is a central part of an attribute of seeking to age well. Not surprisingly, connections with family, friends and society was central to well-being for people. Clearly, this is one of the biggest areas, isn't it, that's been so challenged over the recent times. And I think for those of us that are still living in Melbourne, it'll be interesting to see how this evolves over the next little while. I'm confident that many older people will pretty quickly get back to connecting and socialising in ways that they have before. But it's also true when we look at the COVID data that some of the older people will continue to be some of the most vulnerable people even after being double vaccinated. So naturally, there are going to be people that are hesitant to return to groups. I have the opportunity to chair the senior ministers, the Minister's Senior Advisory Group. And in those conversations, and I've got a whole range of stakeholders in the room, one of the things that's come through very strongly is a question about how quickly some people are going to return to groups. And I'd be really interested in your observations about that. You know, the degree to which, and I get letters like this, people saying, look, I'm really happy to go back to my university of the third age group or men's shed or whatever, but can I have a commitment that everybody is going to be vaccinated? Or, you know, how do I know that safety and safe practice is a central part of going back into groups and activities? So as a commissioner, I haven't formed an assumption that everybody is just automatically going to return to their, you know, their former activities. I also know that many groups have innovated over time, and it's been again a real two-edged sword. Some groups have been able to move to an online environment and explore things like Zoom in a way that they never have before, and that's been a positive for many. But of course, then you end up with the whole challenge of the digital divide, that many older people are unfortunately locked out of that, and we need to intensify training and support. But one of the positives I've heard through COVID, because I've spent, you know, as much time as I can back with groups of older people and their support organisations and peak bodies, there are a number of older people, and it's come through in the most recent national data, a number of older people that have really engaged more deeply with technology because of the supports of so many organisations, and a number of you here today may well have been those. So, you know, all good peak bodies, neighbourhood houses, groups like University of the Third Age, men's sheds, and so many others, local councils that have focused on upskilling older people around things like Zoom so they could be more actively involved. And some people have said to me, and I went to a graduation session recently of 20 older people, all 80 and above, that had actually used Zoom for the first time. And some people said to me, I actually enjoy this. I find this an easier form of participation. I can remember someone saying they've actually got hearing challenges. And so whenever they go to the group, they try to go to the front, but then they can't hear what people behind them are talking about. So being on Zoom was actually an improved form of participation. So I'm interested in the degree to which groups try to find some sort of hybrid models where they might still do some things online and still look at face-to-face at other times. So it'll be interesting to see how this picture of interaction and groups actually evolves. And again, I'm really interested to hear what's happening in your areas. Another really important part of the whole spirit of ageing well is actually the sense of the world changing. Now, I did this piece of research before we moved into COVID. So this was done just at the end of the prior year. And it took me a number of months to assemble all the information into, you know, the report and the attributes. But one of the really powerful things that people spoke about way back then, or seems way back then anyway, in terms of our COVID journey, was the importance of staying in touch with a changing world. That this was just so important. And again, there were a couple of different elements of this. Sometimes there's a sense that as we get older, we become resistant to change. And some people can name that they really had to challenge themselves to be open to change. That not to assume, say, for example, with that technology issue, that just because I'm older, maybe with the right training and support and the right assistance, I can engage. For other people, obviously, there always have to be alternatives. It really stood out as almost like a three-part conversation. There's a group of older people that said to me, don't assume that because I'm older, I can't engage on technology. I've done it in lots of my lives and I just continue to. Significant group in the middle who would say to me, look, I can do a bit. I can maybe send text messages. I can engage a little bit with a smartphone or work on an iPad, but lots of other things are beyond me. But if I could get the right training and support, I could do more. And there's another group of people that say to me, Gerard, no matter what training or support or cost or subsidies, I can't do it. It's beyond me. What are the alternatives? How can I connect still with real people? How can I connect with printed information? So the challenge of the changing world, I think, is a really critical issue for policymakers. And it's certainly an area that I strongly advocate on each of those areas. Don't assume that just because someone's older, they can't use technology. How can we better support people to engage better with technology? And what are the alternatives for people that aren't going to be able to involve in the digital world? How do we make sure that they're not only getting access to information, but they feel part of the changing world and the narrative? So the last couple of ones, I'm just going to move through a little bit quicker because we've got conscious of time. Safety and security and finances, obviously really central to well-being of people. Cost of participation in social activities, cost of things like technology, affordability of homes, affordability of rent. So safety, security, financial security are really central to the well-being of older people. And, here's a quote, an example. It's not possible to access all services or needs due to financial limitations. Choice and access to services sometimes reliant on having sufficient money. And so what does this mean for people like myself? Looking at things like the concession programs. Have we got enough discounts availability for those that are particularly challenged financially? How can we extend access to other programs and supports and services? And how do we continue to focus on emerging areas of where discounts will be needed? The other thing that was really important from a housing point of view was what I've got here is the ability to age in place with the right supports. And it was interesting when people talked about that, I got a better understanding from these conversations than I've had in the past. Sometimes in the past when people have talked about aging in place, I've assumed they've talked about the particular house that they're living in. But they gave me a much better understanding that often what they're talking about is not necessarily a specific house, much more likely to be a community. And so a lot of older people were open to moving to a different housing situation, but they very much aspired to be part of the community. And I think this is an ongoing challenge for, say, local government in particular, from a planning point of view. How do we make sure at the local community level, there's enough housing options and housing choices that are affordable? And I think that's a really critical issue when we look, for example, at the push up in house prices recently. And so cost and affordability continues to be a critical issue for so many older people. The second last area, and this is one that of course comes to mind so clearly and a really critical issue, is managing health, including mental health. What I got a better understanding this time around is that when people talked about health, this time they were much more clear with me about what I call the principle of empowerment. Help me better understand and help me better manage my own health conditions. Older people were really keen to take increased responsibility, but they didn't necessarily find they were getting the supports and the assistance to do that. And so here's a practical quote of what they talked to me about. Doing everything you can to maintain good health, healthy diet, and access to health services when required. But you can see this link back to what I talked about at the very beginning, the positive aging issue. Am I open to reaching out for support in a timely manner? And I've often given the example, and some of you may have heard this before, about like a walker frame. Some older people are very open to the fact that they're getting mobility challenges, and so they'll look for things like walking sticks or mobility aids fairly early on. But other people will say to me, this was a 2 or a 3 or a 4 year journey before I knew I was having mobility challenges, but I couldn't really come to terms with the fact that a mobility frame would actually aid my independence. In their own mind, there was this real stigma, what I've called in my report internalized ageism. that they saw something like the use of a walker frame as a stigma and a barrier, like putting a sign, "I'm old," on themselves and walking around. So I think we can't assume that people are all going to be open to receive the right support at the right time. And I think conversations amongst older people themselves, with health service providers and others, with medical practitioners, are really important, so that we don't assume that everybody will be open to receive supports, and we're able to open up pathways and opportunities for them. And so that's what I've referred to as the personal waiting list barrier. That for some older people, the barrier isn't the fact that there's a waiting list for home care for the Commonwealth, and that's an absolutely critical issue that needs to be addressed, but there's a bigger waiting list. They haven't yet got to the point where they're willing to act on what they see as their emerging health needs. And so I think the whole issue of waiting periods, etc., is also underpinned by an acknowledgement that for some older people, there's a bigger barrier, and it's the battle that's going on within them about being open to receive services and support. And the final of the attributes is being able to get around, and in rural areas, in lots of communities, this is really significant. The ability, and this sits at sort of two levels. It's the ability to have mobility at a personal level, so things like walker frames or other devices that allow me to move around the community more often. And I think technology will bring a continued lot of innovation in this space. Motor scooters and other things, I have no doubt, will continue to evolve. But it's also around service access. So how do we provide, for example, a lot of conversation about local community transport. So how do people get from point A to point B, or groups of people move around local communities, and clearly a very critical issue for rural communities. And so I just wanted to finish with a couple of very high-level observations beyond my report that have come more recently around ageism. And I think this is a really important part of the emerging conversation I'm keen to lead. So what is ageism? It's about how we think, and I gave an example of those stereotypes. It can also be about prejudice. There can be some real prejudices that sit there, and it can be about discrimination. And it tends to have sort of three elements to it. There's the structural ones, where someone, because of age, is denied a service. It could be a health service or something like that. It could be the fact, say, if you look at the NDIS, the way we've designed the NDIS is if someone is assessed to have a need, we put around them a wraparound package that's intended to meet those needs. Yet if we look at what do we do in the home care system for aged care, there is, in my view, structural ageism. That instead we've got 4 packages and we fit a person into the package. And it might not necessarily meet all their needs, but it's sort of like a best fit model. And we have only a certain number of those packages available based on a mathematical formula. And so I think, there are some examples of what I'd call structural ageism. There's the individual ageism that people feel, and often it's around language of invisibility, or I don't receive the same opportunities. It could be mature age employment, a whole series of examples around discrimination that individuals may feel. And then there's what I think is the emerging knowledge we're beginning to gain about internalised ageism. And it sits more of a factor for us as an individual to deal with. What are the things within us that are stopping us receiving support because we've accidentally owned this concept of ageism and how we think about our own life journey itself? And so here are, I've talked about some of those elements of ageism, so I'll probably top up that one. And I wanted to finish with sort of an example of if we were to design some statements and some commitments that reflected a proper approach to a world that we're trying to building, how would we make sure that we avoid ageist and ageism sort of language? And here's some examples, and this is only one very high level one, but everyone should be treated equally, no matter their race, gender or age. And while our community is beginning to recognise injustices of racism and sexism, the prejudice many of us still don't see as ageism. From the way older people are ignored by shop assistants to the ageist jokes in birthday cards, age-based discrimination is surprisingly common, but that doesn't make it right. If we want to create a more equal society, we need to ensure people of all ages are treated with dignity and respect they deserve. And so I think, we need to think about how we can have conversations at our community level, at local government level, to think about, structural and other forms of ageism and how that applies in our communities. And so for those of you that are interested in meeting my full report, there's some links in this presentation when it gets circulated around that can take you to the report. Those of you that might want to join with me on my Facebook or LinkedIn profiles, you're very welcome to do that. And a new resource that I've just put up there for those of you, and it's only been released this week. It's that slide that I put up here comes out of this booklet, Framing Age Message Guide, where it starts to try to build a narrative of how do we have conversations at a community level about what ageism looks like and how can we avoid that whole shift and move into ageism. So I know I've covered a whole lot of areas, but I wanted to sort of give a bit of a dip in snapshot to so many different elements of parts of my report. And at this point, I'll be quiet and have a drink of water.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I'll now hand over to my colleague, Sharon Kingaby, who's the Aboriginal Regional Development Officer, and she's going to introduce our next speaker, Jill Gallagher. Thanks, Sharon.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, everybody, for being here. I'm really honoured to be able to introduce you to Jill Gallagher. Jill's the CEO at VACCHO. So Jill spent the last 23 years advancing Aboriginal health and wellbeing through her work as the CEO. She's a highly respected Aboriginal leader and advocate for self-determination outcomes in the Victorian Aboriginal community and a former Victorian Treaty Advancement Commissioner. In 2013, Jill was awarded the Order of Australia. She's also an inductee of both the Victorian Honour Roll of Women and the Victorian Aboriginal Honour Roll. Thank you so much for joining us, Jill.
Thank you very much for that very, very warm welcome. Before I begin, I would also like to acknowledge that I am on Aboriginal land. I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. But I'd also like to acknowledge the Gunai-Kurnai lands. A lot of people don't know, but Gunai-Kurnai lands grew me up, actually. I've lived from every town from Sale right up through to Cann River. And spent most of my very early years, primary school years, throughout Gunai-Kurnai country. So I have a very strong affinity with it. So thank you. I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present also. And any elders that may be in this room and also all the people who are joining this symposium today. Thank you. And I acknowledge your contribution to this very vital area of ageing well. Sharon, I'd like to acknowledge you and for all your hard work. I'd like to thank Richard and Jackie for their work also. And last but not least, I'd also like to acknowledge Gerard Mansour for his brilliant work in this space. I've had on many occasions had the opportunity to have the same platform, so thank you. A lot of the issues that Gerard has raised in his presentation I can resonate with very, very well, and I'll go into a little bit of detail. I am a proud Gunditj Maora woman from Western Victoria. My country reaches from South Australia border. I'm not sure whether those borders are opened up yet, but from the South Australia border, right through to Portland, Hayward, and right down to the oceans. As introduced, I am the CEO of VACCHO. I've been at VACCHO 23 years, but I also took a break to do the treaty advancement gig, and now I'm back. Aged care or ageing well is a strong passion, not only of VACCHO, but also of me personally, because I am aging. I don't like to think I am, Gerard, but I am aging, and it'll be a long time before I use a wheelie too. So, but anyways, the VACCHO, we are a peak body for Aboriginal health and wellbeing, and VACCHO members. We have 32 Aboriginal organisations spanning across the state of Victoria. And a lot of those members deliver aged services, whether they be aged care in the home. We have 2 currently residential aged care services, Aboriginal aged care services in Victoria, and that is ACES in Brunswick East and also the Rumballara Residential Aged Care Service up in Shepparton. Our members span right across not only Gunai-Kurnai country, but also, as I said, through to Warrnambool, right down up to Rumballara, Mildura, the Mallee. Yes. But today, I actually want to just talk a little bit about the unique understanding of the Aboriginal understanding of ageing well, or what is ageing. But, you know, words cannot describe the critical role elders play in our society, in the Aboriginal community. Our elders are cultural knowledge holders. Our elders are custodians of Aboriginal traditions and values. Aboriginal culture, in Aboriginal culture, prior to contact, prior to colonisation, ageing was a special thing. It wasn't frowned on or looked at as if we're past our use-by date. It was a very special realm to be in. Because of that, elders being the cultural knowledge holders and the custodians of Aboriginal traditions and Aboriginal values. So with ageing, our people saw with that comes wisdom, and the respect and that acknowledgement of that respect was very much forefront. As keepers of culture and the heart of our communities, elders, they impart and sustain a rich cultural heritage from generations to generations, including, even today, including translating culture into contemporary ways. In this important aspect, the community's future really depends on our elders playing their roles as elders. And ageing shouldn't interfere with it. Throughout this extremely challenging year, I personally have drawn so much strength from culture and from Aboriginal elders. I have many mentors who are elders, but easily the most inspiring person in my life is my mum, who is 96 and resides in an Aboriginal specific residential aged care facility. My mum provides me with so much strength and so much guidance as an elder, and he's always been there for a yarn. But in recent times, those yarns have had to be virtual and not face-to-face. As you can imagine, talking to a 96-year-old woman, an Aboriginal woman at that, on FaceTime did lead to many mishaps, but also many funny memories that I have of my mum on FaceTime. I got to know about how mum embraced technology. She hated it. But she persevered. And when I speak to my mum on FaceTime, I'm either speaking to her nostrils or I'm speaking to her eyebrows, one or the other. And I always remember one little incident where we had not a FaceTime, it was a Teams, where the staff at ACES organised for mum to contact me via Teams. And my screen, it was only her and I on this Teams little get together. And my screen froze. I could still hear Mum, but she couldn't hear me or see me. She could see me, but I was frozen. And I could hear her saying, "Jill, are you there? What's wrong? Have you gone to sleep on me?" So that was quite a story that I will get to tell around the campfire when I am able to go back to country. And there's a lot of other funny stories that I can tell about my mum and technology. We've got to remember she was born in 1926 as an Aboriginal woman, where she couldn't even vote or own property or land or a house. But life hasn't been easy for my mum and those of her generation, so at my elders. There have been many major challenges that she has gone through. Our elders have been let down, and as a result, the critical role they play has been diminished. And that is something that VACCHO is very keen to work on, to ensure no matter whether our elders are in the home still or in a facility, that they still have to maintain their critical role in community as elders. And how do we do that? Marginalisation, discrimination, disadvantage and racism have led to a deep distrust of government and institutions. And with the Royal Commission concluding, the Royal Commission into aged care, the recent Royal Commission I'm talking about, concluded that aged care system is not ensuring cultural safety for Aboriginal elders. And that's another aspect that VACCHO is really keen to work with service delivery out there. How do we turn that around? It's not a criticism, it's how do we help you guys do it better? And I think that's the issue. When talking about ageing well from an Aboriginal perspective, it is so important to look at the barriers and the challenges that our elders have faced over the years and that still face today. For many years, the health and wellbeing needs of Aboriginal elders were largely ignored. Addressing these challenges head on is the only way we will ever see meaningful improvement. And the only way we'll ever see meaningful improvement in quality of life for Aboriginal people today and tomorrow is if we work together as a system, as a service system, and it's so important. I spoke earlier about the 2 Aboriginal specific aged care residential facilities that we have. Aboriginal people in Victoria, we're less than 2% of the population. So we're not going to get Aboriginal specific aged care, residential aged care services sprinkled throughout Victoria because we don't have the population to sustain it. So how do we make the existing service system, or how do we help? I don't think the word make is not the right word. How do we help the current service system to be more culturally strong and appropriate for Aboriginal aged care? A few years ago, I got to go on a trip across this great continent of ours, and I got to visit a lot of Aboriginal communities, both in remote, urban and rural. And what has always stuck in my mind was an Aboriginal specific residential aged care facility that exists currently in Coopapedi. And what they did when they designed their Aboriginal aged care facility, they designed it to suit the needs of the Aboriginal people that were going to use that facility. So remember where Coopapedi is, it's quite remote. And so there's a lot of remote Aboriginal communities that exist in those areas. And so what they developed, which I was very impressed with, it probably wouldn't work here, but the point that I'm making is designing services for Aboriginal older people or elders has to be designed in a way that suits the local needs of the local Aboriginal community, or the local community in general, so to speak. Doesn't have to be Aboriginal specific. But the Cooper Pedy Aboriginal Aged Care Facility it was designed in a way where all the residential facilities were in a circle, and in the middle of that circle was desert, and with a humongous big gum tree. And I know there's OH&S issues that they had to take into account, and there was a humongous big campfire, which was well controlled, by the way, when it wasn't. But what the elders could do if they felt like it, because a lot of them weren't used to, they were still sleeping out in town camps, in desert camps. So they could pull their swag out of their room and sleep under the stars, but still safe, medically safe and safe. So that was a culturally appropriate service. The other service that they provided was when they did aged care in the home. Now, I'm saying in the home in Cooper Pedy, I'm talking about in desert camps, basically. So what they did was outreach, and that outreach was actually what the elders needed in those remote camps was they needed water. They needed access to wood for their fires, and of course their medications. So that was the outreach that was provided to those elders in those town camps from that one aged care facility. So that's an example of how a facility, both residential and outreach, was designed for that environment. And I think that was a really good example. So working together requires having a lot of conversations, developing rapport and relationships, not only in this case in the Gunai-Kurnai country, but with with mainstream service providers and our members that exist in those areas. Some of the examples that I want to talk about a little bit in relation to the aged care system and some of the challenges that our people face is, one, access to residential facilities, culturally appropriate residential facilities, I might add. Access is a humongous problem. Access to beds. Not only access, but how do they navigate the My Aged Care system, the My Aged Care assessment, the language and the technology that you have to use to be able to navigate that system. Our people struggle with that. And hopefully, out of the Royal Commission that just recently happened, there will be a lot of changes that helps Aboriginal community people and organisations navigate those complex systems because they are complex. Language is really important. What language we use, I don't mean we all have to speak Aboriginal language because I can't do that either. But, you know, I mean, a lot of it's very complex. And so how we talk to our elders is really, really important. In the document, Good Spirit, Good Life, there's a lot of good recommendations in that document, like the importance of yarning with elders, the importance of being on country or walking on country, or if that's not possible, how do you bring country to the elders within the facility? I think that's really important as to how we do that. I've already touched on a little bit about yarning is such an important part of our culture. It's at the heart of our culture, actually. Telling stories, storytelling is so important. It's so important to have that yarn. Even I myself, even though I'm not aging, by the way, people, no. I love sharing stories, and I'm going to tell you a few stories in a minute. But I love sharing stories because what it does for elders also is it keeps them connected to their roots. It keeps them connected to their community. And it keeps them connected and strong in memory. And I think that's really important. That's the important part of yarning and telling stories, is keeping our elders connected to memories. And I found that with my mother. When I get to see her, whether it's virtual or face-to-face, is having those stories. And straight away, Mum relates back to her country, and it triggers memories. That's when she starts talking about it. So it's really important to have the ability to yarn to elders, and so then they can start yarning back with their memories. Walking on country, sometimes it's not possible to do that. But how do we make sure that the importance of us as Aboriginal people to having the ability or the opportunities to go back to country? I don't live on my country. I live on Wurundjeri country. And when we open up rural on Friday, I'm planning to go this weekend, go back to country because it has been a while. So they're two important points for ageing well for Aboriginal people, is yarning and being able to talk about their country or walk on their country. I remember there was an elder who was in a facility once that she couldn't physically go back to country. So what we did, we organised for a bit of country to go to her in a way of, whether it was some soil from her country, whether it was some special vegetation that we had in her room, or photos of her country that we had taken and put up around her room. So there's all those things that mean so much to Aboriginal elders that is really important and easy to do. I'm not going to go on too much. I want to talk that before I do close a little bit about what Gerard and Mansour talked about, talking about how older people feeling if they use their little wheelie walkers, if they that is so true for Aboriginal elders too. I mean, my mum is 96 and she's been in ACEs now not quite 2 years. She only started using her walker when she went into ACEs. She refused to use it, even though she loves her shopping. She would refuse to use it. We used to have to find seats for her to sit down when we took her shopping. So she hated the thought that people saw her as getting older and useless. So I think the very great points that Gerard has raised. The other thing is, Mum for many years has been going deaf. And I don't know, about 7 years ago, or might be a bit longer, we organised for a specialist to come in and do an assessment, and they ordered a hearing aid. And so Mum wore the hearing aid for about a week. By the way, she hated it. She was very reluctant, but she hated it. She persevered for a week, and then she took it out and refused to use it again. And when I asked her why, she said, well, it actually made me go deaf, Jim. I said, really, Mum, the hearing aid made you go deaf? She said, yes. I said, why do you think that? She said, because as soon as I took it out, I couldn't hear very well at all. So it made me go deaf. But what she didn't realise, while she had it on, she was hearing quite well. So they are really important things to understand and know about. But in closing, I just wanted to, I think we all know that colonisation that happened 250 years ago, it was brutal and it was very quick. And the impacts that it had on our people and our communities and our culture, it was devastating. today we still feel a lot of those impacts, and some of that manifests in some of the issues that we see in our communities today. When you look at the over-incarceration rates of our people, when you look at the, Victoria, believe it or not, we have the highest rates of children in out-of-home care, Aboriginal children, on the planet. And our ability to continue to age well in our cultural ways of aging well was greatly impacted through these impacts that colonisation had on our communities today. But our elders need to be cloaked in culture, whether they're in their home or whether they're in aged care residential facilities. And we need to do that together as Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people. So my parting comment or my closing comment would be, together we can make the change that's needed for our elders, but we can't do it on our own. We can't do it without you guys, and I don't believe you guys can do it without us. So thank you
very much, Jill, for that wonderful presentation. Also like to hand over to my wonderful colleague, Sharon, who's going to moderate this Q&A session with Jill and Gerard. Thanks, Sharon.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Jill and Gerard, for your presentations. I always learn a lot from both of you. There was a question, Jill, for you, perhaps, so that we know that in culture, it's really important for us to, as you talked about, to express our respect for our elders. And we often do this by doing things for our elders. You know, sit down, Aunt, I'll make the cup of tea. You stay there, Aunt, I'll bring you your dinner over. How can we, as workers and stuff, how can we do that? How can we still show our respect, but also help our elders be independent? That's that wellness and reablement approach that we're also pushing for.
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. I'm going to attempt to answer it. And my mum didn't feel any loss of independence if I keep asking her to make it. Could I make her a cup of tea? What she did feel loss of independence is if I tried to help her down some stairs, or if I tried to disempower her somehow as an Aboriginal woman, or as a woman, as a person. So I think there's other ways you can still maintain that respect that you have for elders, but still also without making them feel disempowered. I don't know whether that's answered that, Sharon, or not, but I just think there's other ways you can do that.
I think that's the right word, isn't it? Empowering and disempowering.
Yes.
There's a way that you can do it.
Exactly right.
Respectfully, yeah. I have a question for Gerard now. Do you think, Gerard, that most personal ageism is basically unconscious?
Yeah, good. Very good comment. I think it is. I think ageism for most people is actually an unconscious bias. I rarely meet somebody. Sometimes I do. I got to say, some of the comments I hear, I think that's pretty poor. I wouldn't like that. Like that old fossil comment. That was really intended to be nasty. But I think for most of us, it's an inadvertent thing. I do. I love the way Jill talked about the way the elder is respected in the Aboriginal culture. If you think of the contrast, how Jill talked about that and what I hear from most older people. You're talking about two really different experiences. So, you know, where people are encouraged and valued in a position of respect. And, you know, Jill, I love the way you talked about, you know, even people living in residential aged care, how can we continue to do that? I'm much more likely to hear a comment from the average older person being about, I'm increasingly feeling invisible. You know, so I think there is a real contrast of cultures. So I do think it's inadvertent for most people, but I think that it's something that we've got to politely challenge each other on and to talk about that openly. You know, how does our language, because that's why I put that little booklet up at the end, Sharon. I think the choice of language is really important to send a message. And if I could just add a comment to what Jill was talking about in that first question. It reminds me of my mum when the home care workers were trying to encourage her to the re-ablement, that, you know, she might like to help them with the cleaning. That was a very short conversation. She said, I've paid taxes all my life. I'm sitting down and you can do the cleaning. So re-ablement won't work for everybody, but I do think that, you know, the empowerment word is so central. It's how do we have the conversations to older people where their value that they hold most is that they can still make decisions. That's what independence means, that they can still be allowed to make decisions. Would you like me to make a cup of coffee? To me is the way I'd phrase that, or a cup of tea, rather than, oh, I'll make you a cup of tea. Do you want a white one or a black one? You know what I mean? So I think to have the discussion with them and get a sense of their values, and as Jill said, if they don't want to help going down the stairs, they'll let you know that pretty quickly.
Oh, that's true. That's so true. Jill, there's a remark from Kay in the chat that says over the years, Kay provides services out of a local council. Over the years, they've tried to provide support to elders before COVID, and often they've been met with the response, I don't need any assistance, my family will provide everything I need. And Kay's question is, how can we work with the family to achieve this?
It's a very good point, Kay. It's a hard one, but it is working with the family because the expectation, and this is where the difference is from, although my mum was a little bit different, by the way, because I wanted mum to live with me, and she was adamant that she wasn't going to live with any of her family at all when she could no longer live on her own. But she was adamant she wanted to go to ACEs and no other aged care facility. So it's about how you work with the family. And we've got to remember too, Kay, there's still a lot of trauma within our communities, the transgenerational trauma that impacts from colonisation. So a lot of Aboriginal people, you know, that trust is not there. Maybe it might be good to, I don't know, Kay, whether your organisation engages with the local VACCHOs or not. Maybe that's a way of doing some sort of, you know, if our mob aren't accessing your support, why? And I think the VACCHO should be able to help you untangle that web, so to speak, or make access to them a lot easier for you. So a number of ways, through the VACCHO, and persevere with the family. Maybe the family needs support and not the elder.
That's a really good point. Often that's the case, isn't it? Yeah. Question for Gerard again. Did your research show that most senior Victorians don't think of themselves as being senior or old?
It did. I've got to say the one word that most people consistently, I'll give you an example. I can remember I was at a meeting in Broadmeadows and I had about maybe 50 or 60 people in the room, and I was asking people to tell me a little bit about the things they do that inspire them. This was before this particular piece of work. And so at the front, on the left-hand side, there was this older gentleman, and I'd seen he'd come in with the walker frame, but he did what a lot of people did. He left it at the back of the room and walked the rest so that people could see that he had the walker frame. Anyway, he got up and he said, Oh, I'd like to tell you about what I said. Yeah, tell us about. So the microphone went to him and he said, I'm 92. He said, I've got 12 children, 13 grandchildren and 4 great-grandchildren. And what I enjoy doing is visiting the old people in the nursing home. So there's no way in his 90s that he had any sense of owning this word old. So I think old for most of us is someone further on than us. That's how people tend to use old. You know, very rarely, I can't think of a time anyone said to me, I'm old. I think there's a best language, best guess. I think most people like senior. Although I have noticed, I was at a forum just recently where the National Ageing Research Institute did a bit of work around how do we best talk about the mental health system? And they were given some options. We currently called it the aged person's mental health system. People didn't like that. They much preferred older adult. So it was interesting, when you put older with adult, they didn't mind that, calling it the older adults mental health system appealed to them much more rather than aged persons. But generally, old, don't go there.
Yeah, I feel that way myself because I'm not old either, Jill. An interesting comment again from Kay, but do you think that our grandchildren or the younger people don't have enough interaction and exposure to their grandparents and older people in their lives?
Is that for me or is that for...
No, it's just a general comment, really. And I think
okay.
it's a really good one.
Yeah, it is a good one. Look, from my point of view, the last 18 months, no, but it's really important.
Yep.
I mean, my mum, I've lost count how many, cards you sped by my front room. My mum, I've lost count how many grandchildren, great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren my mother has. But prior to COVID, and mum went into ACEs during COVID. She was always had access to her grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and so on. It was I think it's crucial. But what I see today is a lot of grandchildren that don't see the importance of that. And I don't know how we get that back.
Yes, I don't know how either, but I agree with you. Hand back to you then, Richard.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you, Jill and Gerard, for your great answers. There was a comment, which I'm not sure if it's worth expanding on, by Brenda from South Gippsland, who wanted to comment about the challenges languishing with COVID and with elderly, socially isolated clients over the past 2 years with lockdowns. Did you, Brenda, was that a question that you wanted to pose, or Jill or Gerard, is there any comment you'd like to make around that?
I'd like to make a comment, a very brief one, from my own personal experience with my own mother. ACES is only a small aged care facility. It's not a big one. Through all the lockdowns, it's been extremely hard for my mum, especially if there's been a bit of a scare within the facility. Then, like in the very early days, my mum started to get a lot of bladder infections, which comes with a temperature and feeling unwell. So automatically everyone says, isolate, isolate, COVID, COVID. So mum spent a lot of her days in her room on her own until I basically had a conversation with the senior people of that organisation and said, that's not right. You know, it is actually bladder infection, not COVID. But I understand the fear, and they looked after my mum medically okay. I think they struggled with looking after her mental health and well-being and the levels of loneliness that she went through. I don't know whether all aged care services experience that or not, but that's my own personal experience.
Would you like to make a comment about the concept of ageism in our communities and Koori communities? You think it's there?
I've got to understand, Sharon, the question.
I'm sorry. Given the respect that we have for our elders,
yep.
Do you think that ageism is a part of our communities?
Oh, okay. I probably just need to explain the concept, how we perceive ageing as Aboriginal people and cultures right across Australia. You know, and in some areas of Australia, it's still very, very strong prior to contact. As I said, Victoria was really heavily hit, and we were one of the first areas, apart from South Australia and sections of New South Wales, that were impacted first by colonisation and that brutality. So we still value our elders' knowledge and our elders' contribution. It's still there, still strong as ever. That hasn't been diminished in a big way. But what has been diminished is the fact that we don't still have the practices, and because of all the forced removal, we don't have that at our doorstep for our elders to be able to fulfil their roles and responsibility in traditional Aboriginal society. So colonisation did impact that on a big way in our communities. And I know a lot of traditional owner groups are starting to have a conversation about, well, they haven't just started, they've been talking about it for many, many years, is about, you know, is there a difference between elders and an older person? An Aboriginal elder and an Aboriginal older person. What is that difference, and what constitutes an elder? So I'm not sure. I don't know whether I'm qualified enough to comment whether ageism is a part of our community. Sharon, you might be better off responding to that one. But yeah, but I just think it's colonisation had a humongous impact. And it's still there with us, but because of the systems and processes that we now have here, what we now call Victoria, it's really harder to practice.
Yeah, thanks for throwing that back to me. I thought I threw it to you. Yeah, I don't know. That's a really good question. Good point.
Well, I think I might throw to Gerard. What I mean, in relation to the theory of ageism, what are the key components of that?
I saw from a couple of the conversations I've had, particularly around that report and previously, I think the internalised part of it really was clear to me. I saw that at play, and I think Jill's given some real examples of that. So I'd say that side of it, I'm much less clear. I can't think of examples where I'd say that people's age was seen as a negative. I must say in my conversations, it's much more likely what Jill talked about, that there was a sense of respect and value for older people. But I think that challenge of each of us as we get older, still seeing that we've got something valid to contribute and having an opportunity to do that, I don't think that always comes through. So I think the internalised one is more what I saw.
Thank you, Gerard. Comment from Marty is that lockdowns have exposed the reliance of many older people on informal supports, as well as the reliance the aged care sector has on those informal supports. Reliance on transport for general activities such as scripts and shopping, etc., has risen sharply. Just a very valid comment.
Can I just make a comment to that one, if I could, Sharon?
Sure.
I'm not sure if everyone's picked up that there is a change from this Friday now to the visitor access for residential aged care. This has got to be one of the most challenging issues I've dealt with in my time as a commissioner. I was very directly involved with 7 of the most critical affected facilities last year with the families where the deaths occurred. And what it's done, understandably, has made a whole lot of aged care providers very risk averse. The message that I think the public health area is giving now, and certainly from my observation, is as our vaccination rates got to the level it has, we need to start opening up aged care homes more to visitors. And so that starts to happen from this Friday afternoon. There will be some more information coming out from the public health area before the end of the week. But I think there's a real opportunity for us in our work to start to think about how we can begin to enable some of that access again. That, you know, people are going to look at this differently. One of the things that's going to be there is a number of individual people are going to be saying, oh, I'm not sure if it's safe for me to go back. And so we're going to have some people that are very keen to be at the front of the queue, but still a whole lot of hesitancy. So I think I'd really encourage workers to have pretty open conversations with, you know, people that are living in residential aged care will have connections, as Jill talked about, to people from many, many different geographic areas. They're going to need some encouragement about what does a safe visit look like, and that it's okay. And, you know, we will have the opportunity to take people back into community again, into country again. But a lot of people are going to be still very concerned about what does that look like to do that in a safe way. So I just really encourage that as that communication comes out later this week to aged care providers, that it begins to be a trigger to have those conversations at a local level with community members about the loved ones that we know that are living in either the Rumballah or Races, or they may be living in some other community based aged care facilities. So I just wanted to flag that there is a shift now happening about those services need to start to become more open and more welcoming of visitors again.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Richard, back to you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sharon, Jill and Gerard. Some great questions and some very insightful answers. Now we're just going to move on to a bit of a reflection part of today's workshop. I'm just going to share my screen, but I would ask, hopefully you will have got some questions as a reflective questions and action plan. And if you manage to print them out, they should be in front of you. If you haven't, I've popped them up hopefully on the screen. Hopefully you can see them all now. But I guess we were hoping to spend just a couple of minutes to actually ask each person to reflect on your own current practice in terms of what you already do well to support your clients to age well, and also where there might be some opportunities to further support your clients to age well. There's 4 different areas that we've asked the questions in. So I'd ask you to pick 1 or 2 that best relate to your work, because we know we've got a whole range of people who work in a whole range of roles across Gippsland. So the first couple of questions are up there. So what strategies does your service have in place to reduce clients' waiting time for service? What else can you do to minimise wait times for older adults or senior Victorians or your elders? Do you currently support your clients to be able to get around in the community? And what else can you do to help them access community transport options? And we've got a couple more. So how do you currently support your Aboriginal clients or elders to stay connected to family or community, especially given the challenges currently? And also, what else could you do to support your Aboriginal clients or elders to stay connected to family or country? And I guess touching on one of Gerard's points earlier around how do you currently support your senior clients to stay in touch with the changing world? And what else can you or we do to help our clients gain opportunities to develop technology skills and knowledge and also access to technology? So could I ask each person to perhaps spend 2 minutes just looking and working out which one's relevant to your niche area of work, and if you'd reflect on what you do well now and where there may be an opportunity. Now, I'd also ask, and we're just about to close the forum, but I'd also ask if you've got any opportunities to please write down 1 or 2 actions that you plan to make, either to the way you work or to the way your service works, on how you can better support your elders or clients to age well. So if you've got an action, we always find it's good to take away a bit of a plan, because we know everyone's busy and flat out. So any actions would be fantastic. So I would like to thank all those people who've contributed, and in particular our 2 keynote speakers. Jill Gallagher, thank you so much for your presentation, and Gerard, Mansour, thank you. Both really insightful, and certainly I think will have a impact on the way I work with my clients moving forward, and the elders. I'd also like to thank Jill's team who I've dealt with, which is Michael and Diane. So thanks, Jill, if you pass my thanks to them. And Gerard, can you please pass on my thanks to Courtney? And I'd also like to thank my great colleagues, Sharon Kingaby, for doing a great job in the Q&A session. And also to Jackie Goodman, who's pulling all the strings behind the scene and making the technology work today. So thank you so much to everyone involved.